And good evening, everybody. Very nice to be back here again. I'd like to be able to say, at different times when you fly and you leave late, the pilot sort of says we'll make up time and we'll arrive at our destination on time. I'd like to be able to say that, but often I find that time is a bit of an enemy for me. So I'm not going to make any promises with a late start that it's going to be sort of no, we'll finish on time, no problems. I was just sort of waiting, miraculously, you've only got to sort of do that half look and all of a sudden the slides come into to play there for you. So we're going to be speaking about patience. But before we do speak about patience, I just wanted to share some good news. Well, at least Joe and I think it's good news. And that is we have another grandchild. So we've got a granddaughter this time. Now, you're probably saying, what's so special about granddaughters? A lot, absolutely, Maureen, absolutely sensational. I'm so glad you said that. Let me just share some Wilson history. Now, that's automatically going to put most people to sleep. But on my father's side, this is the first girl on the Wilson side since 1904. So 120 years. So Brendan, some of you might know my son Brendan. Brendan and Alicia have broken the drought as far as that goes. So Mackenzie Jane is the latest acquisition to the Wilson household. 20 days old, so nobody's counting. But 20 days old as far as that goes. Apologies. Well, yes, you can sort of see the photo. I was sort of looking for a photo that might have sort of taken up more of the PowerPoint, but that was the best one I had. But most of you here, no doubt, have seen pictures of babies before, and you're probably sort of saying, yes, it's we have seen one kid, you've seen them all. But when it's your own, there is something special about your own that is there. Yes, 120 years as far as that. So again, yes, patience. We're going to speak about patience and children a little later on. We're going to round off our discussions because, of course, think of Abraham. Abraham patiently waited for many, many years to have a son. So that's ultimately where we're going to be finishing with our discussions tonight. I thought it might be beneficial just to put together a bit of a definition. When we speak about patience, what do we actually mean? Now, I'm sure most of you have got some sort of idea as to what patience actually is, but I've got a number of different definitions, and what I think is interesting is when we start to look at some of these definitions, we get some different shades, some different hues, and some different, embellishments, and we start to broaden the context as to what is meant by patience. I'm sure for most of us, we're thinking about patience as if you're travelling to work and you're in a long line of traffic and you're not going to make the lights and it's taking ages to get through, or you're waiting at a hospital. That's probably a very good example of patience at work. You're waiting to be you get triaged very quickly, but of course to see the doctor and where the action really starts, there's probably a passage of many, many hours that start to come into play there. So most of us, I think in terms of just having to wait and a level of frustration. I think that is true to some extent. And of course that definition from the Cambridge Dictionary speaks about the ability to wait, but I think what it does start to introduce into the equation is the fact that we have difficulties associated with it. Now, in a sense, waiting tonight to start, was that really an element of patience? I guess in an overall sense, you might say yes, but in the truest sense, that's not really patience. That was just sort of part and parcel of, hey, that's working with technology. They say you never work with technology, you never work with children as far as things are concerned. Certainly if you've got to give a presentation, because there's always going to be some problems that are there. But I do like what this particular definition says. It's suffering without complaining. And I think that starts to do it. How often are we sort of grumbling under our breath with regards to what's taking place? right? Well, that's not really patience. That's really, we're angering, we're simmering. So that's not really patience, because of course you can see even just from that definition, without becoming annoyed. And that's really, I think, we're starting to get into, the real heart of this notion of patience. One of the challenges that we face in our day and age is, of course, everything is instantaneous. Everybody has got a phone. Everyone's got a smartphone. Everybody wants to Google the answer immediately. I'm sure most of you have heard of ChatGPT. Everybody wants to use that or Copilot. That's just the very day and age in which we live. Everything has to be, bang, what's the answer? Nobody wants to spend any time to sort of look at things. And from a teaching perspective, this is one of the challenges that educators these days face, because people want to be able to look up the answer. They don't want to analyse. Give me the answer. Interestingly, there's some research that's come out post-COVID that people's levels of patience, they say, are lower than what they were before COVID. People don't accept. People may have accepted in the past, but the level of patience. So I think it does us well to just reflect upon this notion of patience, because in a societal sense, patience is probably something that is sliding downwards. Yet the reality is, from a biblical point of view, this is a particular characteristic, this is a particular trait that God says that disciples, those who want to follow him and his son, need to make certain that they are developing in their life. Just another definition. So I've got a couple of definitions, because each one of them, I think, just adds just a little bit into what we're speaking about. Patience is not the ability to wait, but the ability to keep a good attitude while waiting. So sometimes we can just wait, but do we have that good attitude? And again, we're going to look at a number of scriptural quotes, because that's what we need to develop. We need to be developing that good attitude. And by the way, that's just a secular definition, so it doesn't come from any religious background. It's just somebody who's sort of put some words together as to how they would define patience. The final two definitions that we've got here, again, there's some overlap of thoughts, but it's finding serenity in the process. Now, to me, when I read those words, I thought, wow, that's really getting down to what it is. It's finding serenity. Do we find, instead of just acceptance, it's serenity? And again, hold those thoughts, because there's a couple of quotes that we'll look at which I think embrace this particular concept. Again, I might also just add, these are not Christian definitions. These are just secular definitions that individuals have put together. Accepting things won't go as planned and will unfold on their own time, when the greatest gifts in life are the ones worth waiting for. That, to me, as I say, I really liked that particular definition. Now, of course, I liked it from the perspective that it's giving us a kingdom view perspective. The person who wrote that, they did not have that in mind. They were just composing those words for the here and the now. But I look at that particular definition and I say that's the sort of definition of patience. That's the sort that we find in the scriptures. It's also the sort of definition that each one of us needs to sort of pick up and take with us if we can. The final definition that I've got there, the ability to calmly wait or endure without getting angry or upset. A steadiness that allows you to persevere in spite of obstacles, to be calm and steadfast through life's difficult times. Again, the point that I'd like to extract from that, life can be difficult. Life is difficult. That's just the reality for all individuals. Life is difficult. And because life's difficult, in a sense, what we need to be able to do is to embrace patience. And we're going to look at a couple of quotes very shortly which remind us of the fact that even though we face challenges, even though we face difficulties, we don't face those difficulties alone. but rather as those who have become associated with Christ, then of course we get the blessings and the providential care that comes through his Father. So, a couple of quotes just to get us underway, and of course couldn't resist. I don't mind sausage dogs. We don't have a dog, but I saw that little dog there and I thought, you know what, that's just a dog that's patiently waiting. And if you've got a dog, you'll know at different times, dogs are very good at demonstrating patience. You know, they'll just sort of wait there. And when I saw that dog, I thought, in a sense, it was a great exemplar when we start to look at this concept of patience. Now, I'm not going to look at all of the quotes that we've got here, and in fact, what I'm going to rely upon, the fact is that when you look at some of these quotes, immediately that's going to say, yes, I know where that is. So it just brings to remembrance concepts, ideas that we know about. The psalmist in Psalm 27, verse 14, wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart. Again, the background of Psalm 27, when you sort of look at it, the psalmist is dealing with some really, really vexatious and challenging issues in his life. But what he actually says is, he says, okay, despite all of these things, here's what you actually have to do. And the key words there are the first four there, wait for the Lord. And that's going to be a resonant theme as we start to sort of look at some of these other quotes. It's all about looking at these in the concept of God's time. And sometimes that's not necessarily the timeline that we like. We have got a finite timeline. God has got an infinite timeline. And the challenge is, of course, trying to get some sort of alignment. We know that one day, as is with the Lord, is 1,000 years. For us, a day, we get so few days. We get something like 4,000 weeks or thereabouts. If you think about it, 80 years by 52, 80 times 50 or thereabouts, 4,000 weeks is what we get. So for us, our vision as far as time is concerned is completely different to God's. But what he does actually ask us to do is, in a sense, to elevate our position with regards to time and to look at it from his perspective as well. Psalm 37 is a really, really powerful psalm. I really like Psalm 37 because right throughout the psalmist actually speaks about the fact of waiting for God. You know, he speaks about the fact that the unrighteous, the ungodly, they don't care about God. They do whatever they want to do and they appear to be sort of being prosperous and everything's going well for them. And it appears that the godly are sort of, not doing as well. But the psalmist there sort of reminds us very, very stridently. He says that, well, there's going to be a change in fortunes, if I can just phrase it that way. And the change in fortunes is, of course, that those who are growing closer to the Father have got a wonderful hope. And so it is about commitment to the Lord. And that itself starts to help us to explain why patience is really important. And one of the aspects and what we can do to develop patience comes down to our commitment to the Lord. So as we grow closer and as we commit closer to the Lord, then in a sense, patience should be what is going to be a byproduct, we might say, of that particular commitment. Psalm 40, I waited patiently for the Lord. In fact, we're going to just have a look at Psalm 40. I quite like Psalm 40, and so on the basis that I like it, unfortunately, we're going to look at it. But I'm sure you like Psalm 40 as well, because this is actually a psalm that has actually been put to music. Those who are musically inclined, I think in one of the worship books, somebody has done that. When I looked at the psalm here, I thought, yes, that's actually been penned to music. But why I thought Psalm 40 was really, really powerful, it's obviously a psalm of David, but he opens up, I waited patiently for the Lord, he inclined to me and heard my cry. To me, I take enormous comfort when I read those particular words. And that is that God does hear our cries. The God who created everything in the universe, he hears the individual cries of his servants. To me, I look at that and I'm in awe with that. God listens. He inclined to me and he heard my cry. So again, what's it doing? It's just giving us confidence that we can place our trust in God. But what does the psalmist say? I waited patiently. And he had to wait in a set of circumstances that were less than optimal. In fact, we might say they were very, very undesirable, as verse 2 tells us. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. So, in the case of David, but by extension for us, maybe that's how we feel, that we are in a pit of destruction. And I think there's sort of a very, very broad way of describing what a pit of destruction might look like. Your pit of destruction might be completely different to my pit. But when we look at it, nobody likes to be in a bog. Nobody likes to be in a bog or a pit of destruction. And this is where David said he found himself. He found himself, but you'll note that the first sentiments that he wants to express is that he had been contacting God or praying to God. He waited patiently. So God didn't immediately just sort of say, no pit of destruction, no miry bog, I'm just going to immediately resolve that particular calamitous situation for you. No, there was a time period that David is acknowledging that he had to endure. Now, if we come towards the end of the psalm, and again, I'm not going to pick up all of the verses from verses 13 to 17, but if you just glance down at your Bible, what you'll pick up immediately is, of course, that David is delighted that he has been delivered. But he also indicates, perhaps in verse 17, that whilst God had delivered him from previous circumstances, that didn't mean that there wouldn't be other disasters or other unfortunate circumstances that would come upon him. And so he says in verse 17, "As for me, I am poor and needy, but the Lord takes thought for me. You are my help and my deliverer." You see, David, and then and I should have perhaps just read, "Do not delay, O my God." In other words, David thanks God for what he's done in the past, but he also acknowledges that God is going to work with him into the future. And so he places his confidence in God. God, he says, is his help and his deliverer. So to me, as I say, I really love Psalm 40. We're not going to look at all of the other elements that are there, but in Psalm 40, it's a psalm that speaks about developing patience. In other words, waiting for God to bring about the deliverance. And it's not necessarily on our times and on our terms. And it's sometimes when we are dealing with unpleasant circumstances, we just have to endure or patiently wait. Now, again, there's plenty of other psalms that we could look at, but time won't permit to do that. But I do like Isaiah 40. Isaiah 40 is a wonderful messianic prophecy that's spoken of by the prophet Isaiah. "They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength." And again, the whole notion in Isaiah 40 is, of course, that whatever the circumstances, whatever the difficulties that we might be facing, we might not be able to run today, we might be faint, we might be weary today, but what's going to happen with the establishment of the kingdom and the bestowal of eternal life is that our strength is going to be renewed. So again, it's patiently waiting, whatever we are dealing with now, whatever the weariness that we might be feeling, What we can take confidence in is the fact that there is a coming day. And Isaiah has said, those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. So the vigour that you may have had previously, and in fact it will be superfold over and above whatever vigour, vitality that we've had in the past in the kingdom, that's going to be something that is going to be absolutely remarkable. But it is about patiently waiting. Romans 12 was, of course, our daily reading. If you follow the Robert Roberts chart yesterday, Romans 12 and 13, I think it was. But in Romans 12, rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be instant in prayer. And I really like that threefold connection that Paul actually puts together. Rejoice in hope. All of us have got a wonderful hope. But he then goes on, and that hope actually often comes as a result of tribulation. And he says that we need to be patient. But he also provides, in a sense, the solution to why we can rejoice in hope, why we can be patient. He says, be instant in prayer. Yes, we live in an instantaneous age, and one of the things that we should embrace is, of course, to be instant in prayer. So whilst we must patiently endure, whilst we have to persevere, it is a case that we can, of course, be instant in prayer. And, of course, James chapter 5, be patient, he says, establish your hearts. Some of you may remember, if you think back to the 1978 conference. I don't know whether any of you went to the 1978 conference, but I can still remember it. Leslie Johnson from the UK was the brother who did it, and the conference theme was, in actual fact, James 5, verse 7, be patient, establish your hearts. Isn't it amazing, some of the things when you're so young? At the time I was 12 at that particular point in time, but some things stick in your mind, and that's always been a very lovely quote that stuck with me. Be patient, establish your hearts. Some of you, I'm sure, will have heard of Leslie Johnson. He did a couple of conferences, wonderful brother, Leslie Johnson, as far as that. But there's a need for patience. I think if we're going to be discussing patience, we, of course, need to have some sort of connection to Romans chapter 8. Now, I'm not going to explore Romans chapter 8 in any great detail, but I think, in a sense, what this does help us to do, it's helping us to align with the fact that whatever's taking place in our life is for our good. And we have to take the words, I think, of Romans chapter 8, and at verse 28, and I've quoted from the NIV, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. So whatever circumstances we are in, I think we have to embrace those circumstances, and this is part of patience in all things. It's not just the good things that happen into our life that we say, God's blessed us, and therefore we just suddenly, we want to align ourselves, shall we say, with a God who just provides good things. The scriptures tell us and make it very, very clear that we will have trials, we will be tested, and the trying of our faith, that's what it's all about. It's the trying of our faith to rid ourselves of those impurities so that we can be that element of gold that's got purity rather than all the dross that's there. But to me, as I say, in all things, that starts to help us to, in a sense, appreciate whatever we are going through, whatever tragedies, whatever circumstances. It's not as though it's a case that, if I can say this, not disrespectfully, that God has sort of forgotten about us because of whatever tragedy we're facing. But Paul wants to make us clear that whatever we are facing, whatever circumstances, God is working for the good of those who actually love him. I think I may have shared this quote with you before, but even if I have, I'm not going to apologise, because I think this is just a wonderful quote by Brother Dennis Gillett, and what it does do, it just reinforces for us the fact that all things are working together for our good. And I think sometimes when we are having to deal with challenging circumstances, that issue of patiently waiting, which we opened up by sort of saying this is what patience is all about. It's not sort of the quick 4 or 5 minute things that we were delayed by. It's perhaps some of the longer, more challenging, vexatious issues in our life. They're the issues that really start to help us to develop this concept of patience. You've no doubt had a chance to read through that, but I really think that just that linkage that Brother Dennis has put together, linking together Romans 8 verse 28 and also 1 Peter 5 verse 7, just by putting those two particular quotes together, bookending them together, what Brother Dennis says, that in a sense all things are working together for our good. James, again, a couple of verses down from what we alluded to earlier. Again, James draws to our attention the fact that we will face suffering. But he says, take this as an example in the face of suffering. Take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. And again, whilst the Greek word for patience and persevered is not the same, the overall concepts are very, very similar. They're sort of fairly interlocking, overarching in a sense. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Again, this is another really great quote that brings together the notion of patience, the fact that it is going to be challenging for us. Perseverance is there. We know the story of Job. We know what happened with regards to Job. We also know the beginning, and fortunately we've got the ending that Job was blessed. The book of Job, and Job, I think it's 42, mentions that. But James himself actually brings it together and says the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Think about that. So linking together this notion of patiently enduring and suffering, and yet James says, get your head around those sorts of ideas, but that can also be discussed in a context of the Lord being full of compassion and mercy. Again, if the Bible wasn't inspired, if there wasn't the wonderful hope that we had, from just a straight secular perspective, individuals, I'm sure, would not come to that conclusion. You would not automatically say, if you're having to face suffering and being patient and persevering, that the God you worship is a God that is compassionate and full of mercy. But James says that that's the case. And the reason he can say that's the case, because there's an ultimate good at stake. That there's an ultimate end that God is working towards. And again, that's what Romans 8 is all about. Romans 8 is actually saying it's not about the finite. It's not about the here and the now. It's about sort of transcending the here and the now. And that's exactly what James is actually saying. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. And sometimes thinking in terms of patience, perseverance, compassion and mercy, that's how we need to view it. And that's really the key thoughts as to how and why we should be developing patience. We should be developing patience because, in a sense, us developing patience is enabling God to demonstrate compassion and mercy towards us. Now, I think it's worth just a very slight digression, and indeed it's perhaps, in a sense, linked to this notion of developing patience, because often when we have to develop patience, it is because of challenging circumstances. And I think when you look at it, we've basically got, when it comes to suffering, you've got three choices. You can either let the suffering define you, and indeed, I'm sure all of us can think of examples of individuals who let their suffering actually define them. You can let it destroy you. and that people get overwhelmed. And again, without sort of wanting to join the dots too far, there are some people who become so overwhelmed as far as that is concerned. But the final thing is you can let it strengthen you. And that's really, I would say, that's the encouragement for all of us, that when we have to address suffering and doing it patiently, it's all about letting it strengthen us. Now, again, 2 Corinthians 12, you'll be familiar with these words. That this is Paul that is speaking. And I think it does us well just to reflect, because, again, I say from a human perspective would say, we look at what Paul was able to achieve, right? If the impediment, if the handicap, if the disability that he's pleaded, he just didn't ask, he's pleaded, if that had have been removed, a human way of thinking would be Paul would have achieved, let's say, that, what he did, he could have achieved that and so much more. That's the human thinking, that if that was done away with, then more could be done. But Paul provides us, in a sense, with the answer. And the answer is God's grace. You know, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And he says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And this provides us, in a sense, with the answer. Of ourselves, we are weak. But in our weakness, that's when we can embrace God's grace. That's when that grace, that mercy, that compassion, which James speaks about, that's when that can then work in our lives. As I say, I look at what Paul said there. 3 times he pleaded. It wasn't just once that he hoped that it might go. And to me, when I read something like 2 Corinthians 12 and I balance it up with some of the Psalms, what I walk away with is, yes, God demonstrates. There are certain things, as Psalm 40 demonstrates. David could sort of say, I waited patiently for God and he took me up out of this pit of destruction. In other words, God resolved the challenge that I was faced with. So we've got that on one end of the spectrum. On the other end, God's still working in people's lives. We've got another end where the solution isn't how we would like it, as in the immediacy of release from the destruction, whatever calamitous circumstances we were facing. The other is also a solution, God's solution. And God's solution is that the grace that he provides through Christ, that in itself is a power, that is a strength. And Paul could say, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Because it ceases to be about us, but it then becomes more about God and about Christ. And the relationship that we have with God and Christ then becomes stronger. So to me, I like to sort of see those bookend, those in a sense, the polar extremes. That, you know, God can work that way, but equally he can work this way. And we have to, I think, appreciate and understand God is not always going to give us a Psalm 40 type experience. God will not always do that. And let's be honest, if that was the immediate response, that, you know, you worship God and immediately you get a Psalm 40 type response, guess what would happen? Everybody would sign up. This would be the world's best form of insurance. Sign up because, bang, you worship this God and you're going to get a Psalm 40 type experience. Now, I'm not saying that some of you won't experience a Psalm 40, but equally, God provides a 2 Corinthians 12 type experience as well. And that 2 Corinthians 12 experience isn't sort of, this is the plan B, that this is sort of my second option, that this is just demonstrating how God works in the lives of individuals. Sometimes there is that immediacy. Sometimes the immediacy is through his grace, but also the compassion and the mercy. Remember, God is working for our ultimate good. The quote from Brother Dennis Gillett, linking Romans 8, 1 Peter 5:7, putting all of that together, I think it starts to give us a better and more well-rounded view as to how God works in our lives. Again, this is a quote from somebody who was a Dutch watchmaker from World War II times, Corrie ten Boom. You can never learn that Christ is all you need until Christ is all you have. I reckon that's a powerful quote. It is linked in a sense to 2 Corinthians 12 in that way, but it just sort of frames those particular words. And maybe for some of us, this is what we need to know and what we need to learn. All things are working for our good, but sometimes we need to know that all that we've got is Christ. That's the rock. And indeed, Psalm 40 speaks about God being a rock, the stability in our lives. Christ needs to be that same rock as well, that same level of stability. Hebrews 6. Again, the writer to the Hebrews in chapter 6 and at verse 12, he says, imitate those who through faith and patience inherit what has been promised. Again, powerful linkage, powerful connection. We have to imitate those who through faith and patience inherit and the promise. So we start to get a bit of a montage, a bit of a picture that's put together for us. Here we've got a situation where we've got a linkage between patience and our faith. But importantly, what does it also remind us? It provides the hope, the inheritance, the promises that are sure and certain. And that's what the writer to the Hebrews says there. Hebrews 6 and at verse 15. The writer goes on, he says, and thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. He waited for 25 years. Now, 25 years, I sort of reflect on my own life. Well, it's 2024, it's pretty close to 25 years that we've had of this particular century. I reflect back what I was doing 25 years ago, what's happened in my life in 25 years. 25 years from a human life is a significant period of time, certainly today. Now, arguably, I guess in the case of Abraham, some might say, oh yes, but he lived for 175 years. But even so, that is still, 1/7 of his life. I shouldn't do maths, but Leon's not here. Sorry, Leon, missing you tonight, but I've just done some maths without that. It probably isn't 1/7, but I'll leave it at that particular point there. I think it is 1/7, actually. Yeah, it is 1/7. David, weren't you a maths teacher? Were you a maths teacher or a science teacher? Both. But you're too polite to sort of correct me as far as that goes. 25 years, though. He waited patiently. Yeah, and we read about that in Genesis over just a very, very short period. In the passage of us, if we're reading Genesis through the Robert Roberts chart, in the passage of around about 10 days or less, about a week, we've got 25 years, just goes like that. But the reality is 25 years in our life doesn't necessarily go like that. He waited and he waited. He patiently waited. And guess what happened? He obtained the promise. And I really wanted to finish, and this is my final quote actually, a bit of an early night tonight, but I really thought that this was just a powerful quote, because what it actually says is that if we patiently wait, we will obtain the promise. And the promise that all of us are looking for is when Christ returns. So there is patiently waiting, and there is about obtaining the promise. And to me, I think that just puts everything into perspective. Yes, life can be challenging. Yes, life can be difficult. Yes, we'd like a different course of events to take place. But sometimes it is a case, as God has demonstrated, and indeed I might say, those outside of these four walls, they have to suffer calamitous issues. The difference with them is that there is not that obtaining the promise, which is for us. So perhaps just to bring a couple of thoughts then to a conclusion. Certainly I think the notion of what patience actually is. It's not just waiting, but it's keeping that good attitude whilst waiting. And indeed it's all about it's that final promise that's there. I think we'd want to take away the words of Romans 8, that God is working for the good of those who love him. And as a couplet, we'd add 1 Peter 5 verse 7. And of course, 2 Corinthians 12, Paul says that Christ's grace is sufficient. So whatever circumstances, whatever challenges that we are facing, Paul is actually reminding us that the grace that is available, freely available through God and Christ, that is sufficient to help us demonstrate patience. So, early finish, thank you.